Human Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello, and welcome to Human Nature. I am Adam Heyman. With me, as always, my good buddy Tyrone. How you doing, man?
Man, I'm a little peeved, and I'll tell you why, because we're recording this just a few days after Christmas, and I get up, I'm excited, I run to my stocking, and it's empty, except for a note from Santa saying, hey, you've been a really good boy this year, but instead of just giving you a few presents, take a look at outside and all the public goods you've got. And I was like, you bastard.
That sounds like a perfectly natural anecdote you're relaying, but I suspect it has something to do with what we're going to talk about today.
That's right.
But quickly, before we dive into that, I'd like to wish you, Tyrone, and all of our lovely listeners and viewers a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. I think this episode's going to drop right after the New Year. Yeah, but boy, public goods. I am well known. People who know me know that I just despise the concept of public goods, and I thought it might be fun to talk about it on the show today, Tyrone, and to give form to the discussion. I thought I'd go back to an article I wrote last summer, July 2024, because I got it all out of my system, or most of it, but I think we can dive deeper on a couple of the issues. So with your indulgence, Tyrone, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to read this article. And then maybe Buddy you'll hop in when you've got something you want to talk about a little further.
Hey, Adam, if people wanted to read the article along side by side watching this video, where might they be able to find that?
Well, if you're on the YouTube page, we will link to it, of course. But
Okay.
also, you can just go to haymannature.substack.com. That's HAMAN, nature.substack.com. And then once you're there, just search in the articles for public goods. And my article, Throwing Mud and Coal and Feces at the Concept of Public Goods, will pop right up.
Yeah, and I like the title of this article. Well, I especially like the subheading, but your title is Public Goods is a term invented by thieves to steal your money. With the subheading, there ain't no such thing. Not really. Oh boy, you are gonna have to defend yourself on this one, buddy. Saying there's no such thing as public goods? What?
I come well armed, good friend.
All right, man. Well, let's dive into it.
All right. The article goes as follows. If you're anything like me, you were taught that markets are good for producing private goods like food and clothes and houses. And isn't it wonderful that we live in a free society so such things can be produced efficiently? But we are also taught that there are these other things called public goods for which government provision is only good and proper. The grift, idea, is that some goods have the characteristics of non-rivalrousness and non-excludability. And further, if goods have both of these characteristics, government production funded by taxes is appropriate for provision of those goods. The term non-rivalrousness means that you can enjoy the good, and I can come along and enjoy it too, and so can a bunch of other people. Each additional person enjoying the good doesn't diminish the ability of the others to enjoy it also. And the term non-excludability refers to the situation where a provider can't charge for the production of the good. Once the good is out there, everybody can enjoy it whether they pay or not. This is also sometimes called the free rider problem, or sometimes that the good has positive externalities.
I'm really glad you threw in that last part of the sentence there, referring to it as positive externalities, because I feel like these terms, non-rivalrous, non-excludability, are, I don't know, very technical or advanced terms, and it's just not part of your common language. So again, just coming off of Christmas, having to deal with those same family conversations around the table, inevitably somebody always brings up politics, and I try to stay out of it, but every once in a while you get suckered in, to the who will pay for the roads and the parks and the national defense, the public goods thing. And we hear a lot about negative externalities. You hear this a lot, that term a lot. So, especially when talking about environmentalism and climate change, these negative externalities, right? So, I feel like that's a term that's more in the parlance of the mass. Of the masses, so to speak, and so I like using positive externalities, right? But who's against a positive externality, Adam? You are a
Uh,
real curmudgeon.
no, I mean, I think positive externalities are great. Well, let's first talk about negative first.
Okay.
Um, it is a problem, a quote unquote market failure, if there are negative externalities. It means that the costs of performing some action, making a product and selling it, are not borne by either the seller or the consumer and are instead being forced to be borne by people around who aren't involved in the transaction. The classic example is pollution.
Mhm.
And I agree, pollution is a problem that should be addressed. But from a libertarian perspective, all you need to solve that is a proper adherence to and protection of property rights.
Right.
I do not have the right to pollute some river that you have a riparian property right to. I'm not allowed to just blow smoke all over the place and invade other people's property um, and their person. And then positive externalities, I find it perverse to think that government needs to come along and ensure that positive externalities happen. I mean, just mowing your yard and planting a garden provides a positive externality to everybody on your street. Dressing cleanly and showering every day is a positive externality to everyone you come in contact with. We flood our environment with positive externalities all the time. And I think it's perverse for government actors, who I view as thieves, to come along and insist that positive externalities are so great that we really ought to tax the public in order to create more of them. And who gets to define what those things are going to be? Well, it's the guy taxing you, of course.
Well, and that's a great but subtle point because it's oxymoronic in a way, or it's self contradictory in this way. An externality, by definition, is supposed to be a byproduct of something that just occurs naturally. So pollution is a byproduct of
Yeah,
just burning oil or whatever. But a positive externality, if it only comes about because taxes have been extracted, it's not a natural byproduct.
right.
It's not an externality. It's the opposite of an externality. It's a paid for program. So anyway, I don't know.
No, I agree. I think people, government actors and government apologists, try to obfuscate that issue by being slippery with words and definitions. Um, and we'll get deeper into all of that as we continue on. So I write, the two classic examples of public goods one usually hears about in school are lighthouses for maritime navigation and celebratory firework displays. Both are even mentioned in the Wikipedia entry on this subject. There's even a lovely picture of a lighthouse, surely the quintessential public good. The problem is, private production and operation for a profit of lighthouses has been a thing for hundreds of years. Fireworks, too. Sure, there are government funded displays, but there are private ones as well. People can figure out ways of charging for these things. Back in the day, lighthouse provision was often tied to fees for the associated docks and harbors. That's before the government came along and nationalized them. And fireworks can simply be part of the ambience provided by a large resort or part of HOA amenities. Heck, lots of people just light off fireworks for themselves and don't care one bit about the free riders who are mooching off their largesse. So, what gives? I thought economics was a science. What's with these sloppy definitions? And Tyrone, let me just break script here and intrude and say, I live in Las Vegas. We have dozens of fireworks displays provided by private operators in this town. 4th of July and upcoming here in a day or two, New Year's Eve. It's because people think that providing that will be good for the community, will draw people towards their venue, and just a way to celebrate in ways that don't bother them at all, that they're incurring this expense and, oh no, losing all the value of my positive externality. Criminals speak this way, not good-hearted people. I mean, look at all the fireworks displays in your neighborhood. Your neighbors are lighting off these rockets, and except for terrorizing cats and dogs, sorry, kitty. Everyone thinks that this is a thing they're doing for the benefit of their neighbors because people like to watch fireworks.
I would say people should really check out this article because you just have a ton of links in this article. Probably more links than you've had in any of your other articles, and they're worth really diving into because this is a complex issue because it's fought for so hardly. Uh, it's fought with such vigor by the pro government proponents of the public goods theories that uh, they have come up with a ton of arguments against our side of it, right? And so it can be quite slippery and in depth. And going to that lighthouse one though is really, I think, and I'm not saying it's a deep hole, but you don't specifically mention this economist in your article. But if you click on one of those lighthouse links, you will see some reference to Coase, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's done a lot of great work that a lot of our sort of libertarian types appreciate. And he was he sort of came up with a definitive study of how lighthouses came about and how they were paid for fees. But then there was like counters to him. Well, the government was still involved, and therefore you can't really say it was a free market. And then he came back with some counters to that. So it's definitely worth a deep dive. But ultimately the point is, and you're going to get this pushback every single time from any person that you argue with. They're going to say something like what Obama said during his campaign. You didn't build that.
You didn't build that.
Right. Well, of course. I mean, the world we live in today is not absent of government. The government's involved in everything. So the fact that a lighthouse can be built in any way with the use of private funds at all means that the that the costs of that lighthouse are probably more than normally would have been without the government. So that's always my pushback. So people will say, well, none of this would be possible if it wasn't for government in the first place, because they create law and order and stability and regulations and things like that to make it possible for these things to come into existence. And the counter from us should always be, well, no, actually, they're only impediments, and the final product you get always means it took longer and cost more than it should have.
Or at least they're on net impediments.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they do tax us for trillions and then, throw us a few scraps and then point to the scraps and say, see, how would you get these scraps if not for us? When Obama said that line, of course, it incensed me. And I was immediately reminded of the libertarian snarky remark. The government is that entity that breaks your legs and then hands you a pair of crutches and says, see, without me, you couldn't even get around.
Yeah. The old Harry Brown line. But
and
it seems stupid or silly, like lighthouses. What are you talking about lighthouses for, of all things? But to be honest, it's been so well studied and researched and argued by both sides. It's just a great example that then can apply to any other sort of endeavor.
I highly encourage people to check out my article, self-serving plug, but also, check out those links. Look at the history of lighthouses, because it is just a quintessential public good that people like to throw in your face. Again, it leads the Wikipedia entry on the subject, which you should read, because after you've heard me and Tyrone talk about this and read my article, you will see just how fuzzy and non-sciencey these descriptions are. And maybe this concept is just a fraud.
Yeah. And sorry to harp on the lighthouse thing, but something just popped into my mind that it's sort of like one man's what is the saying? One man's treasure is another man's trash, or something like that, right? So we're like, lighthouse is a positive externality. Of course it is. There's no negatives to it. It's just positive, positive, positive. But that if you can only see one side of an issue, and Alex Epstein makes this point about environmentalism all the time. If you can only see the negatives and never the positives, or in this case, we're on a positive externalities, if you can only see the positives and not the negatives, you are not seeing clearly, rationally, the whole picture. I bet you, whenever the lighthouses were first built, there was some little old lady in the town next to us saying, I hate that light
An eyesore. Yeah.
spinning over my house, right in my window. I mean, so again, libertarians or anyone watching this is interested in economics at all, you need to know one truth about economics that we harp on all the time. In economics, there are no solutions. There are only
Only
trade-offs.
trade-offs. Yep. Bingo. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I don't want to delve into it here, but right next door to the public goods debacle, you will find government exercising either a tyranny towards the public by imposing the costs associated with whatever boondoggle they want to do, or exercising eminent domain and just forcing people off their property so they can build this lighthouse or freeway, or give the property to Pfizer, who decides not to use it in the case of Suzette Kelo, which I hope gets taken up by the court and overturned here this year. I've heard rumblings that might occur.
I'm not familiar with what you just mentioned.
Well, in the 90s, I believe it was, or maybe early 2000s, a small community in New England somewhere, New Haven, Connecticut, they seized a whole neighborhood via public domain. And it wasn't a national government, it was just a municipality.
Oh, wow.
And gave, in order to give the whole neighborhood to Pfizer to build a chemical plant or whatever they build, a pharmaceutical plant. And the purpose of it, the government reason for this, is that Suzette Kelo, who owned the famous little pink house that she took this thing to court, her and her neighborhood weren't paying enough in city taxes. And you compare it to how much taxes that Pfizer was going to generate for the municipality.
Mm.
And on the basis of that reasoning, they said the government has a public interest. We can exercise eminent domain to give private property from one citizen to another in order to increase the tax base. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, who upheld it in a case called Kelo versus, I think, again, New Haven, Connecticut.
They upheld what?
The municipality being able to steal this woman's house and all her neighbors' houses and tear it down in order to give it to Pfizer, who, in the real kicker is, Pfizer didn't end up even using the property. It's just a vacant lot now, I believe.
You've got to be kidding me.
Nope. And I think the case, the Supreme Court is going to take up another case, another area in the country, another specifics, but it might overturn Kelo, which would be lovely.
Wow. That's
your government is evil, ladies and gentlemen, and they'll use any excuse to steal your property.
Yeah, and you just have to follow the money. It's all about taxes. And it's so funny. I learned this lesson, and I just throw that way like it's some sort of byline. It's all about taxes. It's all about taxes. If you want to understand history of civilization, just figure out what the tax structure was. And I remember learning this for the first time when I was traveling in Europe somewhere. I don't remember what. And you would come across these weird buildings. Like, they'd be super narrow but super long. The houses, like, who would build a house like this? It's a rectangle shape that just goes straight. And the tour guy would say, "Oh, well, that's because back then they taxed your property
on the front face of the
width of the front."
That's hilarious. Of course.
And in other countries, you'll see, like, I want to say, I don't want to. So I saw somewhere in the news, someplace in the Middle East, I can't remember where, but they would have like 3-story buildings, except the top floor wouldn't have a roof on it. And you say, like, well, did they just run out of money? Except all the houses were like that. Oh, no. You're taxed by how many roofs you have, how many levels.
Oh, that's
and
hilarious.
It doesn't count as a level if there's no roof. Like, what? Follow the money, people. That's all you need to know.
It usually will lead you right to the source of the evil. So back to public goods. I'm going to reiterate a little bit. So what gives? I thought economics was a science. What's with these sloppy definitions? According to Wikipedia, economist Paul Samuelson in the 1950s is credited with formalizing the concept of public goods. That sounds about right. He was a monstrous statist, and he sure peddled about a zillion textbooks, more often than not purchased by schools and universities funded by taxpayer dollars. Go figure. Another often cited example of so-called public goods are police and fire services, also dams and flood management systems, streetlights, over-the-air television and radio, and national defense. Those are normal, and a bunch of other weird ones. Again, please check out that Wikipedia page. It is a hoot. Um, if you'll notice, several things on this list can be provided privately and are. Others easily could be provided privately if not for government forbidding it or crowding out the private market for it. The argument you'll hear is that without government funding of these things, they can't be produced, or if they can, they won't be produced at, quote, optimum levels. Well, who's to say what's optimum? I'm betting in most situations it's the people with the guns who are threatening to shoot you if you don't cough up enough dough for their pet project that they've gussied up with the high minded con job label of public good. If they are really fancy, they will show you a chart with crisscrossing lines and shout, quote, Homo economicus at you until you fork over the money. Even national defense need not be provided by government. Read here and here, and there I give a few links where you can read about what private provision of national defense might look like. For more on that, if you're still thirsty for knowledge afterwards, check out Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard. And Bob Murphy, who we do a lot of crossover episodes with on this show, wrote a great little pamphlet. I think he was in grad school when he wrote it, called Chaos Theory, that covers a lot of the nuts and bolts and common objections to the concept of a private market provision of not only police service but uh, military protection. Like for a nation the size of large gatherings of human beings being protected by guns and missiles and people without it having to be provided by the government.
So I think Chaos Theory by Bob is required reading for libertarians. It's really what made some things click. And I want to save that for the last one, talking about the national defense, and really rely on Bob's essay there. So maybe we'll finish that up, because I have a few points I want to say on that matter. And let's save national defense for last, because that's always the one that people just can't get over, right? But I want to go back to tell a little anecdote about the private fire, or how would fire stations come about if it wasn't for government. Well, when I was growing up, um, we would go visit my grandmother, and she lived in a very small town in rural Minnesota, farming country. I grew up outside of Washington D.C., so I grew up big city kid. So you can imagine this is quite a different way of looking at things and different culture, so to speak. And I remember driving, being in the backseat of my parents' car. I don't know if we were going to Dairy Queen or Lake or whatever. And you would see all these signs as you pass by the farms or the houses. They have their mailbox, but there'd be this other little placard thing with a number on it, usually like a 4-digit number or something like that, and a different color. It was just weird. It wasn't the house number; it was just some number. And I asked my parents about that. I said, "What is this?" Oh, well, that's their fire station number. That's their registration that they've paid for the fire services, so that if there's a fire, the fire company will come out and take care of it. And it's like, what? That's so weird. But yeah, it was, they didn't have like a big government budget or anything like that. It I don't even know if they had a stoplight in this town back in those days, right? So the way they would pay for things like fire, because people want fire protection, right? You pay for it like any other service. So it
Absolutely.
is possible, guys, and we've done it here in this country with lots of things before the government started crowding everything out. Anyway,
It's also naturally an extension or a relationship that goes hand in hand with your insurance provider. They have an interest in you being covered for fire protection too. You can easily imagine getting a lower rate if you prove that you have a contract with a fire department, or even
100%.
being included as part of the service. I mean, there's lots of ways that these things can be structured.
Or your HOA would be
Absolutely.
part of the fees, or
Absolutely. And if you
whatever.
buy into a big apartment building in Manhattan, there's going to be an arrangement with the board. It's going to be part of the things you're sort of forced to pay into as you buy into it. And there's probably also similar contracts with buildings, that are close enough where a fire could be a negative externality. There's probably anything that people have a financial, well, any kind of an interest in seeing provided will be provided as long as
Right.
there's a market for it.
Right.
All right, so back to my little article. As I mentioned before, I'm guessing that public goods is an idea born by men with guns who wanted to force other people to pay for something that they thought was a good idea. They were either too lazy or greedy to figure out a way to fund it themselves, so they resorted to the use of force. That is not really part of the science of economics, Mr. Samuelson. That is just a robbery. And here I want to cut in and tell a couple little stories to uh, help support your intuition on this matter. The first comes from something I read above. Often, flood management and the building and maintenance of dams is quoted as a quintessential public good. So I'd like to do a little thought experiment. Let's say you're an early settler in an area that turns out to be a floodplain, and a bunch of you have gathered for whatever reason to settle this floodplain. Picture early 1800s or something, if that whets your imagination. And let's say that it comes to people's attention after a couple of decades of people building houses and businesses and populating this valley. It comes to people's attention that, oh crap, this valley's prone to flooding, and what we really need to do is build a dam here at this spot and protect the valley, protect all of our houses. And that will be pointed out by everyone in power that this is a public good. It has to be provided for by the government. We can't rely on private people to pony up because not everyone will. And once the thing is built, there's not that non-excludability thing. You're going to be protected by that dam whether you pay for it yourself or not. And that seems, well, like a perfectly reasonable argument until you think about it a little deeper. What about the people who happen to have had the foresight or luck to build high enough up on the valley side that they're not impacted by the flood? Are you going to tax them too? What about the people for whom, let's say, they just build a little temporary ramshackle hut and they're not planning on sticking around, and maybe whatever the amount this thing is going to cost, their slice of that, what if that's higher than their value of even being in this town? What if they just simply don't want to? What if they disagree with your analysis scientifically of what is bound to happen about the flood water? Is it really going to rise as high as you say? You may be some lunatic who's pontificating. You don't really know what's going to happen in the future. So even if you get as many as 60 or 70 people or percent of the people that think this is a good idea, and maybe that's enough and they'd be willing to fund it privately, but it is pure robbery to extort money from the 30% that don't think this is a good idea, don't think that you're a god who understands and sees all and knows what the future of this valley and the maintenance of this dam is supposed to be. It is just evil to steal money from them based on your interpretation of what the future is and what you think a good idea is. That's pure hubris.
Yeah, and to your point, what about those people who don't need it?
Right.
And you're going to tax them too? I mean, that's a great question to ask. I think that would make people scratch their heads a lot. And then you'll have, AOC saying something like, everybody's got to pay their fair share. And I'll tell you what fair means.
Yeah.
Okay.
What about the people who built right at the basin of this valley, but it looked up and saw that river, that danger, and built their house on stilts?
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
You're coming up with a good sounding reason to justify stealing money and doing what you want with it. But that's all it is. You're just making yourself feel good by inventing the concept of a public good. It's not a good for everybody, and it's not a good worth the money for everybody.
Yeah, and
And you coming along and deciding that for everybody is just criminal.
Yeah, and the forced subsidization by taxes of these quote unquote public goods leads to in economics they call that the moral hazard, right? So the classic example of this is I like your floodplain example because you could just say to those people, stop building houses in floodplain, you morons. but you could say you see the similar things with people that live in like hurricane zones, right? Well, the government keeps bailing them out every time there's a hurricane.
Right.
Here comes FEMA or more government funds to rebuild their houses. Now, I don't want to say anybody that have gone through. I've actually known people that have lived through some of the recent hurricanes, and it's awful and it's terrible. But part of the reason why some of this housing exists because the government subsidizes the negative costs to when things happen versus insurance companies paying a proper premium. Well, they can't charge enough because the government says you can't
That's
charge
right.
more than this amount
That's right.
or whatever, right? And like a one generation of people being wiped out by a couple of floods in a floodplain, maybe their children would wise up and say, you know what, maybe we're gonna go build over there
Or if I
instead.
do, at least I'll pay the proper cost
Right,
and suffer the appropriate penalty for this magnificent view.
right.
Really quickly, going back to the floodplain and the dam, I think in most cases you will be able to find enough people who have enough vested interest in staying in that valley that they will be willing to voluntarily pay for the production of that dam. You know, if it's a
100%.
high enough percent, it might not even be a majority, but interested parties will pay if they think it's in their best interest, and they'll probably take an ownership position in the dam too. I mean, there's maybe power can be generated from it. Who the hell knows? There's lots of
Right.
ancillary benefits from owning property and infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the second example I want to give is from my favorite TV show of all time, Deadwood, on HBO back in the early 2000s, I think.
Howdy, partner.
It's
I don't have my
fictional.
cowboy hat.
It's fictional, but the creator David Milch based it off of actual articles in the local newspaper, the Deadwood Pioneer, I think it was called. And anyway, in this story, a public good hazard, a crisis came up, and the way it was handled, again, he based it off the local newspaper. So something like this really happened. This is Deadwood, South Dakota, before it's incorporated into any kind of an American territory or province or whatever. It's literally ungoverned land. Um, if there was a government there at all, it was from the Sioux Indians that we sort of pushed out of the area or whatever. So it's this mining camp. People have come there to mine, to sell booze, to sell, to run brothels and like to run hardware stores. So it's really a thriving, bustling community, but there's no government. People settle things, the old fashioned way, gunplay oftentimes. So, but it's surprisingly non confrontational in a lot of different ways too, because people generally want to get along. Anyway, the plot point here is that smallpox or something a lot like it comes to the area. I think it was smallpox, and it could devastate the entire region. And it's a classic public goods problem. So, how did the community with no government whatsoever handle it? And the answer was that the three largest saloons/brothels recognized that it was in their enormous financial interest to not have a plague just run through this camp and kill half the people or whatever the rate would have been. So they pooled up the money together to send riders to the next big city to come back with whatever medicine is relevant for this thing, vaccines or whatever, and to pay the local doctor and some nurses to set up a tent to care for the sick. And again, that's based off real stories in Deadwood. It turns out that people who actually have financial interests to protect don't really care about the positive externality problem. They want to protect their interest. I'm sure if they had a government to clamor to, a mayor and a police force to tax people and round up funds, I'm sure they would have done that too, because why not? But in the absence of the allowable extortion of other people, people will handle their own business and see to their own interests, even if, heavens forbid, it turns out that there's positive externalities to what they do. We don't need to resort to the lazy and stupid and evil method of stealing money from other people in order to do what we think is proper. Again, it's hubris.
Adam, that show was really good when it came out. Now that's a pretty old show. Sorry, we're going way down on a side tangent. Oh wait, hold on a second. I'm gonna edit this differently. Say spoiler alert. Oh no, wait, you're supposed to say that at the beginning before you ruin the whole show for everybody. But no, it's an older show. When did that come out? Like early 2000s?
I think so. Yeah, I think
It was
so.
kind of around the same time Sopranos came out. It's when HBO started this whole genre of sort of these long form shows that were more like movies, but broken up into episodes. I remember really enjoying the first season. I recall maybe starting the second season and not being able to get into it. But you say it's one of your favorite shows, so I might have to go back. How many seasons were there?
Just it was tragically cut short. There's 2.5 seasons, I think. I think it was
Okay,
killed halfway through the third. And then 10 years later, David Milch got the cast all together and made
a
a movie
movie thing.
that
Yeah,
tied up
that's right.
all the plot threads that he wanted to tie up. It's all really good. I highly
Kind of like
recommend it.
Josh Whedon did in
Exactly.
Firefly. Yeah,
Serenity. Yeah.
Serenity. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a nerdy side sidetrack, everybody.
All right. Well,
Uh,
we're almost done with this article, so let's finish it up
all right.
and see where we end up. So yeah, I talk about Deadwood in the article. I say it's a great scene and a great show. Check it out. And it's also a great example that absent the immoral use of force, that is the very definition of monopoly government, people do what makes sense for them to do. They work it out. They solve problems. They make agreements. They coordinate their interests through free exchange and free association. Government production of, quote, public goods is just lazy and evil. We would be a better civilization if we realized our mistake and jettisoned the poisonous notion altogether. There, I said it, and for free.
Whoa.
That said, oh, now I make a pitch for becoming a paid subscriber at
Hey,
heymannature.substack.com.
hey, Adam, would you say our show is a public good?
I really would. And in fact, it's so good that we should tax people in order to.
I have a couple of follow up things. I want to ask you this question. A lot of libertarians have a problem with the word public at all, in that they say this is a false concept. It's something invented, like you know the collective, or them, or the people, or the nation. Libertarians say no, we are all just individualists. There's no such thing as the public. But I think it really misses the point, and I think that's kind of silly in a way. I'm totally fine with the concept of a public.
Yeah,
How
I don't
about
have a
you?
problem with it either, depending on, what definition exactly you're insisting upon. I guess if somebody is saying since there's a public, then we need government, this and that and the other, obviously I would object. But
Hmm.
although we think all rights are instantiated in individuals and not groups, we are obviously a groupish species. And
Hmm.
when we gather together and conglomerate into crowds, yeah, I'm happy walking down a busy street and looking at all the people I see and saying, "Oh, look, the public." Yeah, I don't have a problem with the loose usage of that word.
Yeah. So this goes back to an episode we did when we were talking about monopolies, and how this term sort of has dual definitions, and they get conflated or
Yes, they do.
equivocated.
Yeah.
And we were making the point, we really need a different term for monopoly, because what we're railing against when we say we're anti-monopolist is government created monopolies versus the natural monopoly of a one gas station in a small town,
Right.
right? That's not a monopoly, but yes, technically it's one, right? So it's a monopoly.
It's
Well,
worth
say
saying again. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
sorry to cut you off, buddy, but it is worth saying again that the only definition of monopoly that makes any sense whatsoever is if the local polity with the monopoly on the use of force either grants an exclusive uh, license for one person and one person only to provide the good in a certain geographic area. That's a monopoly, or creates barriers to entry so that other people can't enter the field. But yeah, if such a thing occurred in the free market, it would be a natural monopoly, as in your small town gas station provision. And also, whenever people think about monopolies, they really, in order to think about it completely, you'd literally need to think about what all the substitutes for consumers are for that good that you're talking about.
well, where I wanted to tie that into what we're talking about here is, I feel like there's an equivocation here, or there's two different types of public goods. So if we're going to use that term, because that's just the way people talk, it's part of the common parlance. So I think we should embrace that. But I think it's very important to be able to know that when we're talking about public goods, we are identifying two different types. And you already pointed that out, but I wanted to reemphasize that your neighbor keeping their lawn mowed nice and clean, the beautiful flower beds, the trees pruned, things like that. That is a type of public good. And the library is also a type of public good, but one is like the monopoly, one is natural. It's a natural byproduct of an action a human takes without compulsion or force to do so, and the other is paid and built through government force, taxation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't want to take what I'm about to say too far because it'll take us into epistemology and frameworks. And
Sure.
the way we've been, even in this podcast episode, we've been talking about public goods and externalities. It's like we're talking about nouns, these things that exist in the world, and we're describing them. But really, what we're talking about is a perspective or a relationship, right?
Yes, great.
The externality is in the eye of the beholder, really. It's a subjective thing.
That's right. Just like
And
the lighthouse.
Exactly.
The light is positive externality to one and negative externality to a different.
Exactly. So yeah, it's so tempting, and we all do it, to use these words sloppily. But we need to be mindful, because that sloppy language leads to sloppy thinking, which usually leads to evil laws. So yeah, it's good to always focus on what's really going on here. And yeah, these aren't nouns; these are perspectives and relationships. And it's
Yeah. So Adam, this episode we're coming up on time a little bit, but I did promise that we were going to get to the hardest question for libertarians to come up with, or at least anarcho-capitalists such as us to perhaps come up with the defense for, and that is, what about national defense? But hey, Adam, I suggest, this one's so juicy that I think this one belongs with our paid subscribers. Folks, if you want to hear our continuing conversation that I'm going to tentatively title Caveman versus Machine Gun, you should come and become a paid subscriber to Human Nature to see us finish this conversation. Adam, what do you think about that?
Tyrone, my friend, that's a brilliant idea. So yes, please, come to heymannature.substack.com, become a paid subscriber, and you will see a lot of bonus interviews with guests I've had on the show over the time. And Tyrone and I produce extra episodes on various topics that are all behind the paywall there. And as you just said, my man, we will put an episode down there in the next week or so that will be all about the public good called national defense, or broad area defense, something larger than a police force, and how that could be provided by a non-governmental actor using contracts, freedom of association, and private property. It's really not impossible, folks, and we will guide you through it. So, yeah, I think we'll wrap up on that. Thank you, Tyrone. This was awesome. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching and listening to Human Nature. We'll see you next time.